What happens when Hollywood's biggest action star walks into what he thinks is a routine morning show interview, only to find himself face-to-face with a host who's clearly got an agenda? What happens when that host decides to ambush one of the most beloved actors in the world with accusations, personal attacks, and questions that cross every line of professional journalism? You're about to witness one of the most explosive live television moments ever captured, where Tom Cruise found himself defending not just his career, but his entire life philosophy against a host who seemed determined to tear him down on national television. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about ambush journalism. Now, let's get into what really happened that morning. The Good Morning America studio. It was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Producers scurried around checking camera angles. Sound technicians adjusted microphones, and the familiar morning show set gleamed under the bright studio lights. It was supposed to be a straightforward promotional interview. Tom Cruise was there to discuss his latest Mission Impossible film, a movie that had already broken several box office records and garnered critical acclaim worldwide. Tom arrived at the studio with his usual professionalism, greeting crew members warmly and taking time to chat with the makeup artists. He'd done thousands of these interviews over his decades-long career, and this morning felt no different. He settled into the guest chair across from George Stephanopoulos, adjusting his microphone and flashing that trademark smile that had charmed audiences for generations. "Good to see you, George," Tom said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Thanks for having me on the show." George barely acknowledged the pleasantries, his expression already carrying a hint of something that should have been a warning. "Sin, Tom, thanks for being here," he replied curtly, shuffling through his notes with an intensity that seemed unusual for what was supposed to be a light entertainment segment. The cameras rolled, and George opened with what appeared to be standard promotional fare. "We're here with Tom Cruise, whose new Mission Impossible film is breaking records worldwide. Tom, congratulations on another successful film." "Thank you, George. It's been an incredible journey making this film, and I'm thrilled that audiences are responding so well to it," Tom replied, settling into the comfortable rhythm he'd perfected over years of media appearances. But George's follow-up question came like a left hook. "Tom, before we talk about the film, I think our viewers deserve to know about the concerning reports regarding your behavior on set. There have been allegations of you creating a hostile work environment, screaming at crew members, and generally being difficult to work with. How do you respond to these claims?" Tom's smile faltered slightly, caught off guard by the aggressive tone and the nature of the question. "George, I'm not sure what reports you're referring to. I work very closely with my crews, and I think if you ask anyone who's worked with me, they'll tell you that I'm passionate about film and committed to creating the best possible experience for everyone involved." George leaned forward, his voice taking on a prosecutorial edge. "But that's not what we're hearing. Tom, we have sources who say you've become increasingly controlling, that you demand multiple takes for scenes that don't require them, that you've reduced crew members to tears with your perfectionist demands. Is this the real Tom Cruise that the public doesn't see?" The studio audience, which had been anticipating a fun conversation about action sequences and stunts, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the lighthearted morning show content they'd expected. Tom maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened slightly. "George, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Yes, I'm passionate about my work. Yes, I demand excellence from myself and from the productions I'm involved in, but I've never created a hostile work environment. I work with many of the same crew members film after film because we have great working relationships built on mutual respect." "Mutual respect?" George scoffed, his tone becoming increasingly confrontational. "Tom, we have documented incidents where you've allegedly berated assistant directors, where you've insisted on dangerous stunts against the advice of safety coordinators, where your ego has put entire productions at risk. Don't you think the public has a right to know about this pattern of behavior?" Tom's publicist, who was standing just off camera, began to look visibly concerned. This was clearly not the interview they had agreed to, and the aggressive line of questioning was unprecedented for a morning show appearance meant to promote a film. "George, I'm going to stop you right there," Tom said, his voice remaining calm, but gaining a steely edge. "I don't know what your agenda is this morning, but these allegations you're making are completely unfounded. I've worked in this industry for over 4 decades, and my reputation speaks for itself. I work with the best crews in the business, and they choose to work with me again and again because we create great films together." George wasn't backing down. "Your reputation, Tom, is exactly what we need to talk about, because your reputation isn't just about making films anymore, is it? Your reputation is also about your involvement with certain organizations, your public outbursts, your personal relationships that have ended in very public ways. Don't you think all of this affects how people see you as a person, not just as an actor?" The camera operators exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond the typical celebrity interview. The director in the control room was faced with a dilemma. This was compelling television, but it was also clearly an ambush that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Tom took a deep breath, his media training kicking in as he tried to navigate this unexpected minefield. George, I came here this morning to talk about a film that hundreds of people worked incredibly hard to create. A film that's entertaining audiences around the world and providing jobs for thousands of people in the industry. I'm not sure why you want to turn this into some kind of personal attack, but I think we should focus on why I'm actually here. But that's exactly the point, Tom. George pressed on, his voice rising slightly. You want to control the narrative. You want to only talk about what you want to talk about. But journalism, real journalism, means asking the hard questions that people want answers to. And people want to know who Tom Cruise really is behind all the movie star charm. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members who had been casually going about their morning routines were now standing still, transfixed by the increasingly heated exchange. The audience members looked around at each other, uncertain whether they should be watching this unfold or if they were witnessing something that shouldn't be happening on live television. Tom's composure began to crack, not from anger, but from genuine confusion about why this interview had taken such a hostile turn. George, I'm happy to answer legitimate questions about my work, about my films, about my craft. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism. This feels like you've already decided what story you want to tell and you're just looking for sound bites to support that narrative. So now you're questioning my integrity as a journalist. George shot back, his voice taking on an indignant tone. Tom, I've been doing this job for decades. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners. I think I know how to conduct a proper interview. Maybe the problem isn't my questions. Maybe the problem is that you're not used to being challenged. Maybe you're so surrounded by yes-men that you've forgotten what real accountability looks like. That was the moment when something shifted in Tom's demeanor. The professional smile was completely gone now, replaced by a look of someone who had finally realized that he wasn't in a promotional interview at all. He was in an ambush. The realization hit Tom like a freight train. This wasn't journalism. This was a calculated attack disguised as an interview. His years of media training had prepared him for tough questions, controversial topics, even hostile interviewers, but nothing had prepared him for this level of unprofessional ambush tactics on what was supposed to be America's friendliest morning show. George, Tom said, his voice now carrying a warning edge. I think we need to take a step back here. I agreed to come on your show to talk about a film that I'm proud of, that my team is proud of, and that audiences are enjoying. I didn't agree to be ambushed with unsubstantiated allegations and personal attacks. This isn't journalism, this is tabloid sensationalism. George's eyes lit up with what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. He had gotten under Tom's skin, and he wasn't about to let up. Tabloid sensationalism. Tom, these are legitimate concerns that people have about your behavior, your influence, your impact on the industry. Just because you don't like the questions doesn't make them invalid. What people, George? Tom fired back, his composure finally beginning to crack. What specific people are you talking about? Because I work with the same directors, the same producers, the same crew members, film after film. Christopher McQuarrie has directed multiple Mission Impossible films with me. Are you saying he's lying when he talks about our collaborative relationship? Are you saying that all the actors who've worked with me multiple times are just pretending to enjoy the experience? George leaned back in his chair, clearly relishing the fact that he had successfully provoked a reaction. Tom, you're deflecting. You're using your relationships with a few high-profile collaborators to avoid addressing the broader pattern of behavior that industry insiders are talking about. Just because some people are willing to work with you doesn't mean that others haven't had negative experiences. Industry insiders, Tom repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. George, you keep mentioning these vague sources, these unnamed industry insiders, these mysterious reports. Where are they? Who are these people? Because in my experience, when someone has a legitimate complaint about working conditions or professional behavior, they're willing to put their name behind it. What you're doing right now is spreading gossip and calling it news. The studio had fallen completely silent, except for the low hum of cameras and equipment. Even the usually bustling crew had stopped their work to watch this unprecedented confrontation unfold. The director in the control room was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this explosive interview continue. George's response came with a smugness that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Tom, I understand that you're used to controlling your image, controlling the narrative around your career. But when you're a public figure of your magnitude, when you're someone who influences culture and society, people have a right to know who you really are. They have a right to know if the person they're idolizing has concerning behaviors behind the scenes. Concerning behaviors, Tom's voice rose slightly, his famous control beginning to slip. George, what you're describing isn't journalism, it's character assassination. You're sitting there making implications, asking loaded questions, and when I try to respond with facts, with actual evidence of my working relationships. You dismiss it as deflection. This is exactly the kind of irresponsible media behavior that destroys people's reputations based on nothing more than rumors and innuendo. George sensed that he had Tom exactly where he wanted him and pressed his advantage. So, you're saying that everyone who has concerns about your behavior is lying. You're saying that every report about your demanding nature, your perfectionist tendencies that allegedly cross the line into abuse, that all of these people are just making things up. I'm saying, Tom replied, his voice now carrying real anger, that you haven't presented a single specific allegation from a single named source. You're hiding behind phrases like reports suggest and sources say and industry insiders claim. That's not journalism, George. That's gossip. And when you present gossip as fact on a national television program, you're not informing the public. You're misleading them. The audience members were now visibly uncomfortable. Some shifting in their seats, others whispering to each other. This had gone far beyond anything they had expected when they came to watch a taping of Good Morning America. They were witnessing what felt like a public execution disguised as an interview. George's next move was perhaps his most calculated. Yet Tom, let's talk about accountability. You've built a career on being this larger-than-life action hero, this perfect movie star image. But don't you think that comes with responsibilities? Don't you think that when you have the influence you have, when you have the platform you have, that you owe it to people to be honest about who you really are? Honest about who I really am. Tom's composure finally snapped completely. George, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've never had a scandal involving drugs, alcohol, or illegal behavior. I've never been arrested. I've never been sued for workplace misconduct. I show up to work prepared. I do my own stunts because I believe in giving audiences the most authentic experience possible. And I work with crews who choose to work with me again and again because we make great films together. What exactly am I being dishonest about? George's smile was now openly antagonistic. Well, Tom, since you brought up honesty, let's talk about your personal beliefs. Your involvement with organizations that many people find controversial. Your public statements that have raised eyebrows. Don't you think people deserve to know how these beliefs influence your work, your hiring decisions, your treatment of people who don't share your worldview? That was the moment when Tom realized that this entire interview had been a setup from the beginning. George hadn't brought him on the show to discuss his film. He had brought him on to attack him personally, professionally, and spiritually. The questions about his work behavior had just been the warm-up for what George really wanted to discuss. Stop right there, Tom said, his voice now carrying a tone that made everyone in the studio take notice. George, what you're doing right now is religious discrimination on national television. You're suggesting that my personal beliefs, my faith, somehow make me unfit to work in this industry or that they influence how I treat people professionally. That's not just unprofessional journalism, that's bigotry. George's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected Tom to call out his tactics so directly. Tom, I'm not attacking your beliefs. I'm asking about how they influence your professional behavior. That's a legitimate area of inquiry for a public figure. No, George, that's exactly what you're doing, Tom fired back, his voice gaining strength. You're implying that because of my personal faith, because of my spiritual beliefs, that I somehow treat people differently or create hostile work environments. You're perpetuating religious stereotypes and presenting them as legitimate concerns. That's discrimination, plain and simple. The control room was in chaos. Producers were arguing about whether to cut the feed. Executives were being called and the director was receiving conflicting instructions about how to handle what had become the most controversial interview in Good Morning America's history. George realized he was losing control of the narrative and made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. Tom, all I'm trying to do is give our viewers a complete picture of who you are as a person and as a professional. If you have nothing to hide, if these concerns are unfounded, then why are you getting so defensive? Why can't you just answer the questions directly? Tom looked directly into the camera, addressing not George, but the millions of viewers watching at home. I want everyone watching to understand what just happened here. I came on this show in good faith to talk about a film that hundreds of people worked hard to create. Instead, I was ambushed with unsubstantiated allegations, religious discrimination, and character assassination disguised as journalism. This isn't how professional media should operate, and it's not how guests should be treated. The studio fell completely silent as Tom's words hung in the air, creating a moment of television history that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. George's face flushed red as he realized that Tom had just publicly exposed his tactics. To millions of viewers, the seasoned journalist who prided himself on his ability to control interviews and manipulate narratives, suddenly found himself on the defensive against someone who had just called out his unprofessional behavior in the most direct way possible. Tom, that's a very serious accusation you're making, George said, his voice now carrying a defensive edge that betrayed his earlier confidence. I'm simply doing my job as a journalist, asking the tough questions that the public wants answered. Tom's response came swift and decisive. No, George, you're not doing journalism. Journalism involves research, fact-checking, named sources, and balanced reporting. What you've done here today is ambush interview tactics combined with religious prejudice. You've spent this entire interview making implications without evidence, asking loaded questions designed to make me look bad regardless of how I answer them, and now you're trying to gaslight me into thinking that this is normal professional behavior. The studio audience was now completely captivated by this unprecedented confrontation. Many were filming with their phones, knowing they were witnessing something that would become legendary in television history. The crew members stood frozen, unsure whether to continue filming or intervene in what had become a public dismantling of their host's credibility. George made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Tom, you're being overly dramatic. These are standard interview questions that any public figure should be prepared to answer. If you can't handle basic scrutiny about your professional conduct and personal beliefs, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. That was the moment when Tom Cruise, Hollywood's biggest action star, delivered what would become one of the most quoted responses in television interview history. George, let me tell you what standard interview questions look like, Tom said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades of media experience. Standard questions would be about my film, about the stunts I performed, about working with the cast and crew, about the technical challenges we overcame, about the story we're telling. Standard questions don't involve unsubstantiated allegations presented as fact. Standard questions don't involve attacking someone's religious beliefs and suggesting they make them unfit for their profession. Standard questions don't involve ambushing a guest who came here in good faith to promote their work. George's composure was now completely shattered. Tom, I think you're mischaracterizing what happened.